My name is Shruti Bhatt. I do product marketing at VMware, and I focus on virtualization of business-critical applications, which is what we're talking about. And joining me here today are Chris Scudgens and Joel Driver from Office Max. We will have them up here on stage for, in a bit, just talking about some of their experiences and sharing what they've done with VMware and business-critical applications. We do have a lot of great content to cover today, so without further ado, let's jump right in. I see some people still trickling in, but I'm sure they'll get caught up. I'll just put a standard disclaimer, give you a few minutes to absorb that. And jumping right into the agenda. So we'll start with taking a quick look at some of the trends, right? What is VMware doing in this space, and what have we been observing in our customer base? We'll then do a deep dive into some of the benefits from an applications perspective, while also looking at what are the underlying technologies that bring these benefits to the table. Finally, we'll take a look at some of the next steps. What are the recommendations and best practices that we have to offer, considering what we've been observing? And finally, I'll hand over to Office Max to share what they have been doing and what have they learned along the way. Now, here's a situation that might be familiar to many of you, right? CIOs in IT operations really want to virtualize more. I mean, they really understand the benefits of better management, flexibility, agility, and the problem is sometimes application owners need convincing. DBAs, Exchange admins. I see a few smiles around the room. Looks familiar, huh? Now, they do raise some very valid concerns, right? Will my application actually perform better? Will my ISV support me? And most importantly, if I'm going through all this P2V, what's in it for me? You know, how does my application really perform better in a virtual as compared to a physical environment? So as we go through this session, we will answer many of these questions, and hopefully you'll see that applications actually stand to gain a lot from a virtual platform. VMware actually does a lot of research in looking at how are our customers adopting our technologies? And what we observed is that most customers start on that end with the IT production phase. It might be familiar to you if you've been with VMware for a while. What this means is you start with an infrastructure focus, right? You're looking for consolidation. You're looking at your file print servers, your test dev environments, and really consolidating all those workloads. That gets you to about maybe 30% of your data center. And then you realize that this technology can actually be much more strategic to your business. And that's the tipping point when you get into that second phase called the business production phase of the journey. This is when your focus is really on applications, business-critical applications in particular, and you're looking for other things such as better quality of service and better availability. And finally, that gets you right into that last phase, which is IT as a service, where you're serving IT to your business. And we measured it, and turns out that more than 60% of VMware customers today are in phase 2 or phase 3 of the journey. So that just gives you some sort of a benchmarking of where our customer base is relative to this journey. And what we did was, from a VMware perspective, we really focused on 6 key applications to help you virtualize more and more of your data center. And these are really Oracle, including database and applications, Microsoft applications, that's SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, custom Java, and SAP. So what this means for you is that VMware actually has dedicated teams looking at how to make these applications run better on VMware. We also put out a lot of material in terms of white papers, best practices, reference architectures around these 6 key applications. And the question is, how are we doing? So we constantly go out and measure this, and in just 2 years, you'll notice that there has been tremendous momentum in these applications, right? If you look at Microsoft, Exchange, SQL, almost hitting close to 50% there, expecting to cross 50% by end of this year, in fact. And then there's Oracle databases and middleware also making a lot of progress. Even SAP, which is considered one of the most complex and difficult applications, is also making significant progress in our customer base. When I look at these kind of charts, the first thing that comes to mind is why, right? What is behind these numbers? What's driving this trend? Why in just 2 years has this technology suddenly been adopted for business-critical apps at such a rapid pace? The answer is simple. It's really gone mainstream. It's matured to an extent where that perception of risk has gone away while the benefits continue to pile up. In fact, Network World put out this headline some time ago that said, it's time to virtualize Microsoft Exchange, but not with Hyper-V. That's one of my favorite headlines right there. And Gartner did some research that said enterprise production email servers should be virtualized by default. How did they come up with this recommendation? Well, they did a lot of research and compared email servers on bare metal versus virtual. They looked at 7 different categories, and you can see the circles there, which give you the results. Clearly, virtual came out much stronger in 6 out of the 7 categories. In fact, even the 7th one, which was support, if they looked only at Microsoft and IBM, it would have come out strong, but they probably looked at a lot of smaller email vendors as well. I highly recommend this particular piece of research if you're looking at Exchange in your environment. It's called Email Servers and Virtualization by Gartner. And then I talked about benefits. I said the benefits continue to pile on. But from an applications perspective, right, there are really 3 main buckets of benefits that you care about. The first one is quality of service. Are you able to deliver your SLAs? With virtualization, what you get is performance when you need it. We've come to a point where performance as a concern has really reduced because that overhead has come down to within 2 to 10%, and hardware in the meantime has continued to become so powerful that that 2 to 10% of overhead that we talk about is really minimal. On the other hand, you get things like dynamic scalability and dynamic resources, which let you manage peak workloads, which let you manage, in fact, eliminate bottlenecks. And of course, availability. Right? How do we enhance availability? There's built-in availability in the infrastructure, which means you get rid of your planned downtimes. You also really reduce your unplanned downtime. We'll take a look at this in a minute. In terms of efficiency, now this is something you're all very familiar with consolidation. But in this case, we're looking at not just hardware consolidation, but also software consolidation, which means your expensive software licenses, there is a cost savings opportunity there as well. That's about CapEx. But what about OpEx? There was this study from Forrester that just came out where they looked at virtualizing Oracle on VMware and came out with the recommendation that DBA productivity, they actually saw 50% improvement in DBA productivity when Oracle was running on VMware. That talks to your OpEx reduction, right? And finally, thinking about time to market. This is really applicable for you if you have some amount of test and development in your environment. Essentially, with self-service provisioning, not only do you empower your developers and testers to have their own sandboxes, but you can also really streamline and optimize your environments. We'll take a closer look at each of these in a minute. But to sum it all up, it's all about SLAs, cost reduction, and about agility. And I just want to take a moment to point out that in 2011, with our cloud infrastructure launch, it just came out in July, we really focused on this use case of business-critical applications and across the board made all these buckets so much better. I won't spend too much time on each of these. We do have some really good sessions on vSphere 5 in particular and what that brings to the table, but I did want to call out some of the highlights. For example, in terms of quality of service, we now have monster VMs, which basically means you can have VMs that scale up to 1 terabyte of memory and giving you the ability to virtualize really large applications. We also have much better BCDR functionality and security functionalities built in. In terms of efficiency, our intelligent policy management engine also becoming stronger with profile-driven storage and network and storage I/O controls. And finally, we have things like vSphere Auto Deploy, which lets you accelerate the time in your production environment and your test time environments as well. But if I had to call out one thing that really stands out in vSphere 5 for these Tier 1 applications, it's the fact that we now have 32 vCPUs and 1 terabyte of VRAM on a single VM. And one of the few complaints for the largest applications was, will it fit in the 8 vCPUs that a VM could scale to before? Today, with 32 vCPUs, that concern has gone away. In fact, it's 4 times larger than the VM that we had before. And we looked at this and realized that it's actually bigger than the biggest recommended Exchange configuration. If you look at what Microsoft recommends in terms of Exchange configs, and you try to fit that in a VM, a single VM is actually bigger than the biggest one. And in terms of hardware and software support, this is, of course, top of mind. From a verticals perspective, all the top ISVs in their verticals do have full support for VMware. But if you're looking at these Tier 1 applications, some of the apps we talked about before, Microsoft and Oracle, you'll see that Oracle also has an official support policy. I know there's been a lot of discussion about this, so I have a whole slide later on to talk about what this policy actually says. You can access it on my Oracle support 249212.1. We'll look at what it says and what it means for you. And Microsoft has full support for VMware. In fact, they recently came out with Exchange 2010 with a DAG mechanism. This is a new technology they introduced. And even for DAG environments, all the VMware technologies, including HA, vMotion, and DRS, are fully supported in a DAG environment. So we have that level of support from Microsoft. And of course, SAP and IBM have very clear support statements. SAP is one of our closest ISVs as well. Just taking a quick look at a customer scenario. This was Indiana University. They had this massive database which they were really concerned about, and it was running with 12,000 concurrent users at any time, 125,000 total users. This was their on-course application, delivering courses online to their students, so very critical for them. And this was running on IBM P series with 9 Power 5 cores utilized. At the time, this was vSphere 4.1, so we only had 8 vCPUs to play with, and we were concerned whether it would fit in that VM. But when we went in and did that virtualization, migrated it from Unix to Linux on x86, we realized that it's only 50% utilized. That speaks to not just the power of vSphere, but also the power of the underlying hardware and how Linux has matured. A quote from Rob Loudon from Indiana University saying, "We have been able to virtualize our most demanding Oracle databases. We now have the confidence that vSphere can handle our largest transaction processing databases with ease." In fact, these Unix to Linux migrations are becoming increasingly common these days. So that was just quickly going through what are the trends and what we've been observing. Now I want to go down into some of the benefits we talked about. I gave you a very high-level picture of what we bring to the table. Let's look at each of them in turn. In terms of quality of service, there are many different dimensions to quality of service. There's the performance and scalability. And then there's also other things that you need to care about: availability, disaster recovery, security, and your automated operations. VMware today actually brings better than physical aspects to all of these. And if you look at that quote that we got from Alstom saying, it's not just about saving money on VMware, but also about simplifying things like application provisioning, HA, and DR. Thanks to VMware, my wife and kids see me more often. Improving his quality of life, I guess. Now, talking about performance and scalability, the technology has really been growing by leaps and bounds, right? If you looked at this a couple of years ago, you might have had some concerns. Just a few years, it's really made a lot of progress. And with vSphere 5, we went 4 times more with 32 vCPUs, 1 terabyte of memory on a single VM. If you look at the number of IOPS we can do on a single VM today, over 1 million IOPS. Just stop here to think about what are your largest applications and what are the IOPS that you're driving. This is substantially higher than what we've seen in most production environments. So when we've benchmarked against this level of scalability, hopefully it gives you the confidence that your applications will scale well on VMware. And then, interestingly, I want to share this particular customer story. American Tire Distributors, they have this setup where basically retailers can access their systems through these point-of-sale systems, right? And when there's a bottleneck, whenever their site is not responding, what do these retailers do? Retailers don't wait around because customers are waiting. They'll just go to a competitor's site, pull up the code, and give that out. So they were actually losing business while they were trying to find the bottlenecks and trying to add capacity as quickly as they could. What they did was they went ahead and virtualized Oracle e-Business Suite and their Oracle RAC systems on VMware, and a lot more applications, in fact. Why did they do this? Two reasons. One was about automatic load balancing, and the second was being able to scale up or scale out on demand. So finding those bottlenecks and worrying about them really became a thing of the past. So where does this automatic load balancing come from? If you look at it, there are multiple levels to this automatic load balancing. The first is at the host level, at the VM level, right? With DRS, what we do is we load balance your virtual machines across hosts. So you don't have to worry about where the underlying resource is coming from. You have this resource pool. Your virtual machines are automatically being moved around within that resource pool based on the policies that you have set, so you can be confident that those bottlenecks are not developing. The second one is storage DRS. This is something that we introduced in vSphere 5 just this year. What this essentially does is exactly what we do with VMs at the host level, we can now do at the storage level. What you can do is set up tiers of storage. So you have, just like we have in the diagram, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 storage. And we'll make sure that we load balance only within the same tiered storage. So for example, we would not take something from a tier 1 storage and move that to a tier 3, right? Those are the kind of policies that absolutely can be set and controlled very effectively. And finally, something called network and storage I/O controls. What this does is it eliminates that noisy neighbor problem. Right? When you have a shared resource, yes, you get the load balancing across hosts, but you also worry about a noisy neighbor. What happens if one of these virtual machines is really hogging resources? You have some contention, and you're worried about that VIP VM, which might get starved because some other VM is hogging resources. Well, with storage and network I/O controls, you can make sure that you set reservations, you set priorities, guarantees to make sure that if one of these virtual machines is really a VIP, it has access to the resources it needs when it needs it. That's about dynamic load balancing. There's also the concept of dynamic scalability, right? Not just the underlying load balancing, but the fact that now you can hot add capacity. What would you do in a physical environment? You actually have to find the bottleneck, go down to the lab perhaps, figure out, do you need to add memory, add CPU, bring that system down, and do the planned maintenance. Here, you can actually hot add capacity. It's almost as simple as moving a slider on a scale. So if your virtual machine was configured with 1 vCPU and 2 gigs, you can, on the fly, increase that to 4 vCPU and 64 gigs. Now you might say, well, what if my underlying host is running out of capacity? Not a problem. You can just vMotion that particular VM to a larger host, to a more powerful host, and then grow that VM on the fly. Both operations with zero downtime to your application. Now, the first two are really scale-up scenarios. What about scale-out? You can actually provision additional app instances in just minutes. What you would do is have templates. You can have your gold image, right? And with those templates, spinning up additional VMs, something you can do in minutes. In fact, this is the preferred approach that we're seeing many of our customers adopt today, where scale-out architectures are becoming much more popular than scale-up. And then we look at some of the availability mechanisms. This is probably familiar to most of you. If you have a mixed environment, you're running all these applications, invariably you need to provide local availability, disaster recovery, and data protection to all of these. However, it so happens that each of them will have their own separate mechanism for doing this. What does that mean for you? It means it's really complex to maintain these different silos. And you need highly skilled staffs, and the risk of errors becomes that much higher. It's not to mention how expensive it is when you look at things like Oracle RAC, right? What VMware brings to the table is really improving business continuity at all levels. The local availability mechanism is really built into vSphere, right? With HA probably many of you are familiar with. I don't know how many of you have seen that. We actually made the HA app aware. That means before, we only looked at hardware failures, and if there was a hardware failure, we could remediate that. Today, we also look at the application. We have APIs that can look into the application and remediate an app failure as well. So if the app is hung or if the app needs to be restarted, we can look into that and protect you both from the hardware and the application perspective. Fault tolerance, it's still for one vCPU VM, so not for very large VMs today. vMotion and storage vMotion really eliminating planned downtime. So instead of going in and saying, I need to do something to this hardware box, I'm going to bring your system down, all you would do is vMotion it away and go ahead, do the maintenance. Your end users are not impacted. With storage vMotion, you can actually do the same thing that you do for VMs at the storage level. So if you're doing storage migrations, for example, you can go ahead and do that with no downtime to your end users. Data protection also built into the vSphere platform, and disaster recovery. When you think about powering on a VM, it's one of the simplest things you can do, right? And from a VMware perspective, what we can do is we can control how these VMs are powered on. So with disaster recovery, what we essentially do is we can have these automated processes to bring up VMs in your remote site in the order that you want it to come up. And I'll talk about that in a moment as well. But again, across the board, we just improved all of these in 2011 with our cloud infrastructure launch. And vSphere replication, in fact, is something new we introduced where you can do replication at the host level even without storage replication in place. So I mentioned a Site Recovery Manager. What it essentially does is you can really get rid of your manual runbooks, right? All you would do is set up these automated recovery plans where you tell us what VMs need to be brought up and in what order, and then we take care of the rest of that. A big advantage of this is that you don't really need to have identical hardware on both ends, right? Because it's VMs, they can be brought up on any hardware, and you can actually have active configurations where your remote site is probably running some other applications. Whenever you have a disaster strike, you can bring those lower priority applications down, fail over your critical applications. So you really are utilizing your resources. The second big advantage is that you can test these. Because they're virtual machines, you can test your DR plan absolutely non-destructively without anybody even being impacted. So in a physical world, think about how often you test your DR plans and how confident you are about it, and compare that to a virtual world. And of course, in our recent launch, we introduced automated failback. We already had automated failover, as I mentioned, where you fail over your systems. We also introduced automated failback, where we can reverse that direction of replication and bring it back to your primary site. We do have a lot of sessions on Site Recovery Manager, so if you're looking at DR, I highly encourage you to attend one of those. And then in terms of security, vShield is a product family that we introduced some time ago. Essentially what it does is it frees up your security from the physical constraints. Now that you have this shared resource and now that you're able to move things around dynamically in your data center, you're also able to have security that essentially follows your application. This is much more cost-effective than physical security, of course, and much simpler to manage. Again, we do have sessions on this, so I won't go too much into it, but I highly encourage you to take a look at this as you virtualize your Tier 1 applications. And finally, vCenter Operations. This is a product suite from VMware which does things like proactive remediation. I mentioned before how you can do things like dynamic scalability, right? The question is, how do you use that? How does that translate into making things better for you? Let me give you a small example. With capacity planning, what you can do is we can give you alerts that say this VM is behaving slightly abnormally. We think it's a hotspot. We recommend that you vMotion it over to this other resource pool that seems to have more capacity. Or we can do things like recommending that you scale up a particular VM or do any kind of proactive remediation before those bottlenecks develop, right? And when we talk about performance monitoring, it's not just about looking at absolute performance, but looking at what is this VM doing over time, what's normal for this VM versus another VM, and learning that behavior over time. So all these are advanced capabilities, very, very useful for your critical applications, something you might not have looked at if you've not yet virtualized any of your Tier 1 apps. And then in terms of efficiency, database consolidation is something that's top of mind, irrespective of whether you're running SQL, Oracle, or any other database, right? Database sprawl is a major problem. In the physical world, you probably are doing one of these two things, multi-instancing or shared instancing. Now, in either case, there are a lot of challenges, a lot of problems that come with it, right? First of all, you have a shared operating system. Right there, you have a single point of failure. Secondly, you have absolutely no load balancing across hosts. All those databases are really looking for resources on that one particular host. And from an operational perspective, it's extremely difficult. Think about the fact that if you want to do some sort of an upgrade or a maintenance window, it essentially means you need to have all those applications being upgraded at the same time. All those app owners need to agree to that maintenance window, and you need to do that at one shot. In a virtual machine, however, you have complete OS isolation and complete database isolation. So not just is that more secure, it also means that you now have the flexibility to do things during your maintenance windows for different virtual machines. You can run different versions of applications and operating systems based on what it really needs. Not to mention the fact that you now have absolute load balancing across all the different hosts there, right? So for example, let's say one of these VMs is really your most critical VM. It always gets the resources it needs, but you also can set things like reservations and priorities. Try doing that in the scenario we looked at before, where you had the physical environment. Not to mention vMotion and DRS, not just at the VM level, but also at the storage level, right? Storage vMotion, storage DRS as well. So getting all these benefits, and the process to get this is really fast consolidation with P2E. There is absolutely no impact to the application, no change to the operating system. We take the operating system as is with absolutely no modifications. That was about the hardware consolidation, but also let's take a moment to look at the licensing consolidation. This is something we actually measured in a real customer environment. They had a lot of SQL licensing. If you look at the top part of the screen, now let's take a simplistic scenario. Let's say you have 8 different SQL servers running on 8 different servers, and each of these are dual proc. If you are licensing by processor, that essentially means you need 16 licenses for 16 processors. However, with VMware, if you've consolidated that down to just 2 servers, you're running 8 virtual machines on 2 servers. That means you only need 4 processors and 4 licenses. Very simple. But when you do the actual math on the licensing side, here's what we observed. There was a 70% cost reduction just on the SQL licensing alone. But what about Oracle? We talk about Oracle licensing very much in the same way, because at the end of the day, if you're looking at per processor licensing, the same rules, the same techniques do apply. You are still consolidating your databases, and you are still licensing by processor. There are, however, a few caveats, a few rules to keep in mind, which we've laid out here. The first thing they say is that you cannot have partially licensed hosts. That means that if you are running an Oracle virtual machine on a particular host, you need to license all the CPUs inside that host. that's what you would do in a physical world as well. So it's not very different, right? But when you start doing clustering, this question always comes up. Now that my virtual machine can move around inside my cluster, do I need to license multiple hosts in the cluster? Essentially, you can do two things. You can either license a few hosts inside your cluster, let's say host A, B, and C, and you can make sure that that virtual machine only stays on those hosts with something called DRS host affinity. Or you can have a small dedicated cluster or a large cluster, depending on how many Oracle instances you have, dedicated cluster, and put as many Oracle virtual machines as you want on it. So essentially, it's like an all-you-can-eat cluster, license a few hosts, and put as many virtual machines as you want. So that gives you consolidation benefits, even on the Oracle licensing side. And then I've talked about OpEx reduction with intelligent policy management. Essentially, you can do things like taking a VM and tying some policies to it. So you would tie the SLA definitions and say this particular virtual machine needs these SLAs. And the underlying infrastructure is intelligent enough to take your virtual machine and place it on the resources, place it in the resource pool that can actually give you that underlying SLA. This is really true automation, right? It's not scripting. It's built into your infrastructure. So let's say you've tiered your resources as gold, silver, and bronze. We'll make sure we place your critical VM in that gold pool. We'll also do things like automatically provisioning the infrastructure services that that particular VM needs. So not just day one, but also ongoing day N maintenance and day N operations become much, much more efficient. And when you think about accelerating the time to market, we talk about agility a lot, but what does agility really mean? Right? Agility, if you think about it, means different things for different workloads. For example, in your test dev environments, what you care about is fast provisioning. You need to provision and destroy VMs on demand. And that's 75% of the requests that come in for test dev. But in a production environment, you're not really creating and destroying VMs on demand. What you need to do is be able to meet those SLAs while things change very rapidly on the business side. Let's see how you can do both of these. The first one is fast self-service access. With vCloud Director, essentially you can do things like maintaining a catalog of services. What you would do is, let's say a LAMP stack. Let's say a LAMP stack is very commonly used in your test dev environment. You would create that with multiple virtual machines and add that into your catalog. The users can then come in and based on the policies you've set up, for example, maybe you say a testing VM can only be created for a week and it will auto-destroy in a week, set those policies and they get the automated approvals for those VMs. They then access the service and you, from the IT side, can actually track the usage, see how much it's being accessed, and do things like chargeback. So you could either bill them for it, or you could just track the usage and know what you have been delivering to the business. A quote from Bill Frost from Boise there saying, we can give our end users a virtual machine in half hour when it takes 2 to 3 weeks to spec out, order, and set up a physical one. So that's about accelerating your testing and your development time. And I mentioned the second scenario, right? The first one was about fast provisioning. The second one is about production environments. Here, let's take an example. Let's say you have this complex multi-tier application, which has, in this example, simplistically 3 VMs. It could be as many VMs as it might be a database, a middleware, and app tier. You encapsulate them as a VApp. Now, a VApp is just a container. You just select the virtual machines and tell us which machines make up the VApp. We are now aware of the configurations between these virtual machines, and we treat the entire application as one VApp with underlying VMs. You can then do things like complete operations on that VApp as an entity. So you can archive the whole thing for fast rollback. You can take that VApp and recreate it in your test environment, just a few clicks. You'd run all your tests on these multiple virtual machines. And remember, in your test environment, you don't need identical hardware now because this is a vApp and it can be brought up on whatever underlying resources that you provide for the testing. So no more identical hardware and test in production. Run your tests, and then as a whole vApp, you roll that back into production. So you don't have to do a whole lot of scripting to figure out which virtual machines talk to each other, how do they need to be configured, and what do we need to do to roll changes back from test into production. Essentially, it not just means faster testing for these multi-tier applications, it also means much more cost-efficient testing. Right? We, for example, tested this and saw that we were able to reduce the storage footprint by up to 60%. So really streamlining your test dev environments. And then ISV support. This is a much talked about subject, right? When we talk about Oracle certification and support. It's very simple. What they essentially say in that support note 249212.1, what they say is that Oracle will provide support. In fact, Oracle RAC is explicitly supported. In November 2010, they went in and added Oracle RAC to the list of supported configs. We see that as a validation that customers are increasingly putting RAC on top of VMware. And if you look at the statistics, we track this very closely, right? Because VMware does not modify the operating system, there really has not been a single vSphere bug that could have caused any issues in your Oracle database or applications in the last 3 years. And VMware actually offers full support. Consider this an insurance policy. We have a special policy for Oracle on VMware, and you can actually call VMware if you ever have any issues with any of your Oracle applications or databases on VMware. The only concern is that, will I ever be asked to reproduce on physical? That is a valid concern. We absolutely understand it, and which is why we highly recommend that you have a conversation with your Oracle teams. We've seen that when you have that conversation, you talk to the support group, you talk to them and figure out what level of support they're giving you, oftentimes you will get the support that you need. And in terms of certification, yes, Oracle is not certified on vSphere, but the question is, what is it certified on? Actually, Oracle is only certifying on operating systems. Typically, they don't certify the underlying infrastructure. Your HP, your IBM, your Dell systems, have they been certified by Oracle? No. You look at whether the operating system that you are running, has that been certified on your underlying hardware? It's the same. VMware is at the infrastructure level, and we don't modify the operating system. So as long as you're confident that you're running an operating system certified on VMware, we think that that is really all you need to worry about. In fact, even as far as I know, even Oracle hardware is not certified by Oracle. And the same for Microsoft. We continue to expand support. There's a matrix that you can go look up in that knowledge base article if it interests you. What I want to point out is when you do clustering, Microsoft clustering on VMware, this is also something that is commonly done. We do see customers eliminating application-level clustering, doing away with MSCS and using only VMware HA. We also see some cases where customers want to put MSCS on top of VMware, and that is also something we absolutely support and continue to support. And as you think about next steps, right, the data center is evolving towards this optimized shared infrastructure. And what we've done is we've come up with a simple way for you to leverage that. If you look at it, vSphere, the underlying virtualization technology, really gives you the availability and efficiency that you expect from virtualization. And then on top of it, you can maximize the benefits you get from virtualization by unlocking the potential for disaster recovery, security, and automated operations. In fact, we just recently released a new bundle called the Business Production Bundle, something to look at if you're considering Tier 1 applications on VMware. So what you need essentially for a comprehensive solution is just vSphere, vSphere 5 or whatever you have in your environment today. vSphere and the Business Production Bundle together give you that complete solution. So before I hand off to Office Max, I just want to sum this up and say that when we see this progression, what we've observed is that the best place to start is by looking at your application's requirements, by looking at how much is it really utilizing the underlying hardware, which of your applications are good candidates for virtualization right away, and which ones do you want to progress towards. And always start with your easier tier 2, tier 3 apps in production if you don't have experience with it. It really helps to get that experience. Don't start off with that biggest, baddest database, right? Start with the smaller ones and then make your way up, because from a company perspective, it gives you confidence and really builds the skill sets. And finally, consider proof of concepts. We've seen that if there is some amount of concern internally, if there's some amount of resistance from application teams, these proof of concepts really help. You can baseline the performance, you can demonstrate that it works, you can give them some time to play with it and get comfortable with it before you go ahead with your full virtualization project. If you have the skills for it in-house, that's fantastic. If not, VMware has services, or partners have services to actually help you do this. And with that, I want to hand it over to Chris and Joel from Office Max to share some of their experiences.
Good morning. I'm Chris Goggins from Office Max. This is Joel Driver. Pleased to be here and share some of our experiences with you. For those of you who don't know, Office Max is an office supply retailer, so consumers as well as business to business. We've been using VMware for quite some time. Here's a high-level overview of kind of the size and scale of our environment.
There's about 750 VMs. Everything that we do is pretty much on vSphere 4 at this point. We have a mix of Red Hat and Windows. It's significantly more Red Hat lately than in the early days. We put everything on HP Blade servers, and we have a Tier 2 storage solution that we're currently using Clarion, and our Tier 1 storage solution is EMC vMax. And we tie both the network and storage fabrics together with Cisco switches.
So our virtualization journey looks very similar to what Shruti put up on the slides earlier. Started off at about 20%, and then over time, we've gotten to the point where we're about 75% virtualized, up to and including a lot of our business-critical applications, including SAP, Exchange, SQL, Oracle, SharePoint, and then we use TIBCO for our service bus. And from a journey perspective, we started with a data center consolidation. It got us about 20% of our VM environment 20% of our data center was virtualized. It was mostly non-production systems, small line of business apps, relatively low risk. Once we were successful there, and we noticed that there was a significant amount of our environment that was very low utilized. We saw if we targeted just systems that were under 5% utilized, we could get 60% of our Windows environment virtualized. And so that's what we did. One interesting thing about this phase is we did a lot of physical to virtual migrations, which gave us real apples-to-apples comparisons. So we were able to say, look, your application performed this way when it was physical, and look, it's better now that it's virtual because we've modernized the hardware by 5 years. This is also where we did our first mission-critical application, which was Exchange. We took our Exchange environment, which was in a large cluster, actually unbundled the cluster, put it on VMware, and was highly successful. Exchange at this particular point in time was our most heavily I/O-intensive application in the company, and by virtualizing that, it allowed us to go to the next step. Because if we could virtualize Exchange, we really could virtualize anything, and that's where we're at. New application comes in-house, we virtualize it first. We've proven that we can perform this way. It is significantly cheaper to run on VMware, especially if you go from Unix to Linux, and provides us a ton of capabilities that we didn't otherwise have.
Shruti talked about a lot of these things earlier. We can provision servers in days or versus weeks or even months for large projects that had to acquire hardware in the past. And even for a lot of those projects these days, we can offer them a test dev environment sometimes before they even get the hardware in to augment our capacity. If we need to change the size of a virtual machine, either up or down, it's now a trivial operation. So it gives us the ability to actually size the VMs correctly. Chris mentioned also that we prefer VMware HA as our high availability solution because it's so simple. We get a single hardware platform. We lose all the complexities of, in the past, we had NIC teams or configuring array controllers for storage. All that's gone. Excuse me. Also, from a R&D perspective, you can build and tear down environments very rapidly. So we test things that we wouldn't have tested in the past because it would have taken too much time to build an environment. And from a DR perspective, it's really the easiest thing we've found. We're quite confident when we power that machine on in an alternate site, it's actually going to boot because of the drivers are the same, hardware is the same, nothing's actually changed. So last year, right before the peak of the holiday season, our e-commerce team came to us and they were concerned about search capacity. We were able to add capacity and scale out horizontally in a matter of days to get them the capacity that they were concerned about. And then recently, just a couple of weeks ago, we started a Tier 2 storage migration. And we have currently moved about 36 terabytes of virtual machines using a Perl script and the APIs that VMware provides. So we basically feed it a configuration script or a configuration file that says what VMs we want to move and where we want to move them. And we go about our business, whether it's meetings or sleeping while they move.
So about a year ago, we undertook a very large SAP upgrade project. Not only were we going from an older version of SAP to a newer version of SAP, we were going from Unix to Red Hat, and we were also going from physical to virtual. We were very confident that it was going to perform really well, but there's always that concern, the anxiety around, oh my God, we're changing a lot all at the same time. Is this really going to do what we need to do? And once the project launched and we actually started running real business through it, lo and behold, it actually performed a lot better. Our batch times reduced significantly, and depending on which batch it is, anywhere from 70% to 30% reduction time. The maintenance cost alone saved us, over $100,000. We had a significant reduction in our power consumption, and on the Unix side of the house, we patch quarterly, and instead of taking an hour and a half to do each box, it only takes us about 15 minutes now because of this environment.
It's pretty easy to see the CPU differences in the highlighted areas. Shruti mentioned earlier how fast the modern Intel and AMD hardware is. That's really the trick here. VMware didn't make this faster, but we don't see any substantial overhead or penalty for being virtual, and we get all the benefits. So there's some interesting facts around this project. If you do the math, each of the VMs that run this environment now weighs a little under 10 pounds, and they replaced servers that weighed 236 pounds apiece. And it was 5 or 6 racks worth of equipment. Now it's part of a couple of blade chassis. Huge savings there in space.
So we have virtualized quite a bit. We've learned a lot of lessons along the way. Some of these things I wish we'd have learned earlier rather than later. The number one key is to overcome the fear. There's not a lot of technical barriers to virtualizing anymore. However, that doesn't stop people from being concerned about it. It's new, they don't understand it, and the bias is always going to be, keep it the way it is now because I know it works, right? So there's a lot of things you can do to help overcome that fear. One is to have a backup plan, whether that's a documented plan to go virtual to physical or some other method to let your customers know that, okay, if for some reason we're wrong and this goes terribly awry, I have a way to get you back the way you were. We do have a documented and tested virtual to physical plan. We've never used it, but it made people feel comfortable knowing that at least I have this option if things don't go right. A lot of people throw out my app's not supported on VMware. And there's a couple different ways you can approach this. First is let them understand that their application probably doesn't certify on Dell or HP or IBM or anything else. But if that's not enough, get on the phone with their application vendor and walk through. Say, if we have a problem and we call you and we're on VMware, are you going to hang up the phone on us? Or are you going to get us to the point where we can work through the issues? And then if you think that it's actually something related to VMware, can we talk about it? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, of course we're going to help you. Most vendors aren't going to turn away their customers. You want to emphasize the benefits. Make this about them. Give them specific examples. Bring up the time that they needed additional memory and they had to wait 2 weeks. So I could solve that in an hour now instead of having to go out and buy hardware and take the downtime and all the rest of it. Bring up the time that they had a system board failure and they were down for 8 hours waiting for a tech to arrive and he shows up with the wrong part. Now, when the hardware dies, it just goes to another machine and it comes on and they're up in minutes instead of mostly of a day. Be proactive and transparent. Explain how you're going to move them from physical to virtual. Go through the entire process. Anticipate all the concerns they're going to have and have good answers available to them. Giving them confidence that you actually know what it is that you're doing. And then use modern hardware. If there's something that's running on a box that's 5 years old, there's no good reason why it's not going to run on something that's new on VMware. I mean, whatever the overhead is, you've completely buried it with how much faster modern hardware is.
You definitely have to evaluate your bottlenecks and measure the performance. We found we were able to saturate a 1 gig NIC and a 4 gig HBA with a single virtual machine. So you're probably going to find bottlenecks that aren't hypervisor related. And anybody who's done any consolidation up to this point or even any business critical applications, if you over allocate your host to the point you have resource contention, you're going to lose sleep and your customers aren't going to be happy. And the same thing goes for under allocating your guests. It's generally worth putting a little more memory in there if you think it'll be safe. Then you're not going to have the performance conversations with your customer. And you definitely have to measure your performance so you can have those conversations. If there are performance problems, you can lay the facts out and actually look at what the problem is and resolve the issue. And if you start doing these mission-critical applications, your consolidation ratios are going to fall. We stopped measuring it. It was a talking point in the early days when we were doing consolidation. We don't even talk about it anymore. Nobody cares. You also have to know when virtualization isn't the right solution. That's changing over time, but for us, we try to avoid clustering on top of it because we already have the HA from VMware, and anything that's extremely time sensitive, we've tried to avoid up to this point. But obviously, anything with USB keys for licensing or fax cards are out.
And most of all, understand that one size doesn't fit all. The objective here is to make sure your applications are up and running and successful. The virtualization isn't a goal in and of itself. So adapt based on what your application needs. If you know a box only needs 2 gigs of RAM and your application customer is convinced it needs more than that, give them more than that. I mean, it's easy to over allocate on the guest level and make sure you're successful, make sure they're comfortable. And be flexible in other areas too. We don't like doing resource guarantees on the VM side, but if it made somebody comfortable enough to actually take the risk to go from physical to virtual, we would do it in a heartbeat. The priority, again, is to just make sure it's work, make sure that your customers are comfortable with what it is that you're doing, because if they're comfortable and they get the benefits, you're going to be a lot more successful along the way. And so that's it. I think that we can have a little bit of time to take questions. If you have questions, please use one of the microphones on either side. And you can direct them at any one of the three of us.
Thank you. And feel free, we have microphones here. If you have any questions at all, we are happy to discuss. If you want to ask Office Max how they did some things, happy to go over them as well.
Yep.
Hey, my name is Adrian. I'm working for IBM. I have a question for you. You mentioned you're running your Exchange right now on a VM. Do you have a fault tolerance enabled, or do you just rely strictly on HA if something does happen?
Strictly HA.
Strictly HA?
Yep.
Okay, and I have one more question. During your presentation, you were talking about adding resources on the fly, adding CPU and memory. Do you mean you go ahead and make the change, and I'm assuming if you add CPU, you still have to reboot the server?
Some of our environments are hot add, some of them aren't. It depends. We've hot added memory and CPU at this point.
Oftentimes, it does require a reboot because all of our guest operating systems don't support hot add. So we're limited by the functionality of the guest operating system more than the virtual layer.
Okay, yeah, all right, thank you.
Hi, quick question for you on SAP. You had up there the application layer. Did you virtualize the database layer as well?
In this particular environment, the database is too large to fit into a virtualization layer. We also have a CRM environment, and we did virtualize the Oracle layer.
Okay, and are you looking at considering putting it in now with vSphere 5 and the increased CPU limits, or is that
it's
on the
relatively
radar?
It's a depreciation problem at this point, right? So we have this giant hardware that is only like a year and a half old. It's a tough sell financially to go down that path. If we were doing the project today, would we consider it? Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Go ahead.
To what extent is VMware and Microsoft working with each other? It's great you've got Exchange support and SQL support. The ERP Solomon application, we've been told by Microsoft that if we want it virtualized, they will not support it unless it's running on Hyper-V.
So it depends on what the conversation is. We have initially, this was before they had an official VMware support policy, and they told us they wouldn't support, but it never came up. We would call them for support, they'd give them the support. We've never needed VMware and Microsoft to work together to resolve an issue, so it really hasn't come up.
I mean, yeah, outside of them looking at the device manager and seeing VMware, how are they going to know, right?
We haven't been that concerned about it.
We never call in with that type of issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
The simplified hardware makes a lot of that stuff from the past go away.
Sure.
It's usually configuration related or...
Right.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering about your policy concerning memory reservations on your larger SQL and Exchange implementations.
So the applications that are very resource intensive, we actually put in clusters that we don't over allocate. So we don't do resource reservations, mostly because we don't have to. We don't. There's a subset of our environment we just don't over allocate to avoid the question altogether.
So Microsoft and or VMware didn't indicate any kind of issues with not reserving memory on those?
They're really only requiring that you do that so you don't end up causing them to balloon or swap. If you are managing that problem other ways, it really doesn't matter.
Okay. So you're saying that you're managing other ways, meaning we have plenty of capacity on the back end, we don't need to worry about it?
Correct. So in our SQL and Oracle clusters, from a memory perspective, there's definitely no over-allocation, and on the CPUs, it's probably minimal. So the possibilities for memory bottlenecks is not there in our environment.
Are there any customizations you're doing with those larger VMs that other companies might find useful? Okay.
Pretty much, it's our standard build. Everything as you'd expect.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, are you using Site Recovery Manager for your...
Not currently.
Not currently.
Sorry. That's all right.
So you guys mentioned you use, like for Exchange, just one server using the VMware HA for...
It's actually a 6-server environment.
So you are using Exchange cluster?
No, it's 6 standalone boxes.
So do you have any issues with, if the Windows OS had a problem, you could, if you're in a clustered environment with Windows, you could fail over that way. But without it, how do you guys deal with Windows maybe being a single point of failure?
Talk to me afterwards. But the short answer is we haven't had any problems, so it hasn't come up.
Okay.
But come up afterwards. I have some stories for you.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
Just wanted to get some clarification on your SAP infrastructure. You said that you still have a physical, like I'm just guessing P-Series AIX Oracle box running your database, and then you virtualize all your application servers?
In the instance that we highlighted, yes.
So you have pretty much all your app servers running on like what, Red Hat or something?
Correct. Yep.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
Last question. My question is about your hardware environment. So when do you guys start throwing hardware at your for VMware? When you guys reach memory limitations, or do you not get there?
Memory is the place that we have to start adding capacity, absolutely.
Okay.
In reference to the bottleneck that we hit on the hosts, it's always we run out of memory before CPU.
Yeah, so do you guys have problems with the capacity of the blades ever?
No, we haven't really had issues there. The only issues that we've had is bottlenecks further upstream. So the distribution layer at the SAN and the network layer we've hit bottlenecks on. We've had to add additional trunks, things like that. But the size of the blades, we haven't run into any issues. So I think they're going to kick us off stage. So we'll be around for a while afterwards if you want to ask further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.